All right, diving into China's place in the world today, and frankly, it's a bit of a head-scratcher sometimes.
Yeah.
Is China a force for good? Or are we looking at some new kind of empire forming? Kyle Ferrana's book, Why the World Needs China, is our guide for this one.
Yeah, gotta say, that title doesn't mess around, does it? And Ferrana, he really jumps right in, doesn't he? This idea of super imperialism, that's like the foundation for his whole argument.
Super imperialism. Okay, before we even get into whether we agree or disagree, what does that even mean? Help us out here.
So picture like old school colonialism, right? Countries planting flags, claiming land, direct control. Ferrana saying that's evolved, this super imperialism. It's more about powerful countries, corporations, they're keeping economic control, even without those old school colonies.
So less about troops on the ground, more about trade deals and debt, would you say?
Exactly. It's like instead of a king ruling distant lands, it's like corporations, global finance, they're the ones pulling the strings now.
Interesting. Makes you think about how power dynamics have shifted, but maybe the end goal is still kind of the same control.
Right. And Ferrana, to really make his case, he takes us back in time, like walks us through the history of colonialism, how it changed and adapted over like centuries. And then he's saying what China's doing today, it's different.
Different how? Because, you hear about China in Africa, for example, and the story, at least here, is often about China exploiting countries for resources, and
Right.
you know the narrative.
Yeah, and those stories, they're out there for a reason. But Ferrana, he's saying, look closer. Go past the headlines. He wants us to really pay attention to China's economy, especially the Belt and Road Initiative. You familiar with that?
Vaguely, yeah. It's that massive infrastructure project, right? Spans across continents.
That's the one. And he challenges these terms we hear all the time: unequal exchange, debt trap diplomacy. He says they're used too simplistically when we're talking about what China's actually doing.
Let's break those down, actually, because they get thrown around a lot. But what do they actually mean? Unequal exchange always makes me think of how some countries, they're kind of set up to just provide resources, while other countries, they make all the profit from the finished products,
Exactly. Like, even when countries trade fairly, on paper, the country sending out raw materials often ends up with a worse deal long term compared to the country selling back the manufactured goods.
Makes sense. And debt trap diplomacy, that one just sounds scary.
Right. It's this idea that a country, often China in this case, they give loans for projects, but they know the other country can't pay it back. So that debt, it becomes leverage to force the country to do what they want.
Like giving up access to resources or military bases even, right? I heard that one.
Or even just like voting a certain way at the UN. So Ferrana's saying this debt trap idea, it's not that simple, at least not with China.
So it's more nuanced than just saying China's being predatory. There are other factors at play.
He uses a few specific examples to try and show this.
Like what?
Well, he talks about the deal China made with the Democratic Republic of Congo. The Sycomanes deal, it was called. China puts money into infrastructure. In return, they get access to mineral rights. A lot of people, especially in the West, saw that as, exploitation, plain and simple.
Yeah, I could see that.
Right. But Ferrana wants us to think about the context. Like, the DRC, they got roads, mines, things they really needed, and that Western countries hadn't really bothered with, frankly. Was it a perfect deal? Probably not. But Ferrana's point is, look at the whole picture,
It's easy to make snap judgments, but like you said, nuance is important.
Right. And he talks about Sri Lanka, too, and that whole situation with the Hambantota port. Huge project, financed by Chinese loans. Sri Lanka had trouble repaying. They ended up leasing the port to a Chinese company.
Okay, but that sounds like textbook debt trap diplomacy, though, doesn't it?
Maybe on the surface. But Ferrana argues that this ignores a lot of Sri Lanka's own internal problems, political, economic, things that contributed to the situation. It wasn't just about China being, malicious. There was more going on.
So more of a tangled web than just cause and effect, like we often hear about.
Yeah.
It does make you wonder, though, how many other situations are we getting wrong, or only seeing a tiny piece of because of these headlines and sound bites?
And that's exactly what Ferrana's getting at, questioning those easy narratives. And it's not just about China's actions outside its borders either. He wants us to understand what's going on within China, because that influences how they act on the world stage.
Right, which brings us to, what did he call it, the socialist puzzle of China. They call themselves socialists, but then they got this whole capitalism thing happening in a big way too. How does that even work?
Right. It's a good question. So To unpack this whole puzzle thing, Ferrana says, look at the power dynamics within China. You've got the Communist Party, they still hold the reins, and their whole push for common prosperity. But then there's this rapidly growing market economy, and that creates its own winners and losers, you know?
And those two things, the socialist ideals and the capitalist reality, they don't always go hand in hand, do they? Like that whole thing with the mortgage strike in 2019, thousands of people across China refusing to pay their mortgages because the properties weren't even finished.
Right, and think about it, in a lot of countries, that kind of mass protest, that would be shut down immediately. But in China, the government actually took steps to address the protesters' concerns.
Really? What did they do?
They pushed to get those unfinished properties completed. They even offered some homeowners, like, a break on their mortgage payments. It's not exactly what you'd expect from a supposedly authoritarian government, right?
It really makes you question that image, doesn't it?
Exactly, and that's Ferrana's point. China is full of these contradictions, these things that don't seem like they should go together. We need to be willing to unpack them, to understand the complexity if we really want to get it.
It's like Broma's here, and trying to solve a puzzle where the pieces keep changing shape.
Yes. And speaking of complex and honestly sensitive topics, we can't talk about China internally without talking about the situation with the Uyghurs in Xinjiang.
Yeah, that's where things get really heavy. We've all heard the accusations. Human rights abuses, suppression of their culture, even genocide.
And those are serious accusations, and they have real consequences. But Ferrana, he urges caution, especially when it comes to how Western media portrays the situation.
He doesn't hold back on the criticism of Western media, does he? He even goes so far as to call it atrocity propaganda at one point.
He feels very strongly that Western media has a certain narrative about China. They need a villain, someone to be afraid of, and China fits that role too easily sometimes.
So when it comes to Xinjiang specifically, what's Ferrana's take on it?
He's not denying there are issues in Xinjiang, but he really questions the way certain claims have been used, especially the genocide accusations.
Genocide is a very loaded term. You can't just throw that around lightly.
Exactly. And Ferrana points out, if you look at the actual numbers, the Uyghur population in Xinjiang, it's actually been growing, not shrinking like you'd expect with a genocide. He also questions some of the sources Western media relies on, saying they have a very clear anti-China bias.
So it's not that he's saying there's no wrongdoing, but that we should be wary of accepting one specific narrative as the absolute truth.
Right. He actually compares it to how the West talks about North Korea. You know, that's a country often painted as the ultimate oppressive regime. Now, nobody's saying North Korea is perfect, but Ferrana suggests that what we think we know about it in the West, it's often based on exaggeration and caricature.
So basically he's saying don't just accept the easy answers, the ones that already fit what you think you know.
Exactly. Question everything. Look for evidence. Consider alternative viewpoints. Because those stories we tell ourselves about the world, they have a powerful impact on how we see ourselves and how we treat others. And nowhere is that more true than with a global power like China.
It really makes you think. How much of what we think we know is actually shaped by these pre-existing narratives? And how much is based on, like, actual facts, on a balanced understanding of what's really going on?
It's a question we should all be asking ourselves, especially with how much information is constantly being thrown at us.
No kidding. But we're going to have to pause it there for now. Don't worry, we'll be diving back into all of this soon to explore more of what Ferrana has to say, including his thoughts on the future of global power and whether this idea of a multipolar world is even possible. So we were talking about how the way we see China, especially here in the West, it's like influenced by all these pre-existing narratives, right? And Ferrana, he uses some pretty strong language to describe it.
Yeah, like that whole atrocity propaganda thing. He's not holding back on how he feels about Western media and how it portrays China.
No, he's not. And it's not just about Xinjiang, right?
Right.
He uses North Korea as another example. This country that's like the ultimate symbol of an oppressive regime in a lot of ways.
Right. And like, again, I don't think anyone's arguing that North Korea is a great place to live. But his point is that a lot of what we think we know about it in the West, it's based on these extreme examples on caricature, more than an actual understanding of what it's like for people on the ground.
Makes you wonder, are we getting the full story about any country, really?
Yeah.
Or are we just getting a version that fits someone else's agenda, you know? Kind of unsettling when you think about it.
It is. And it just highlights how important it is to be like media literate, to be able to think critically about the information we're taking in. Ferrana's really pushing for that, to question those narratives no matter where they're coming from.
To be skeptical, But not just about what we're reading or hearing, to check our own biases too, right? Like, what am I assuming is true about this situation and why?
Exactly. And to go back to what you were saying before, it's not just about being skeptical of the information itself. It's also thinking about, like, who benefits from a particular narrative? Who's the one pushing it, and what do they get out of it?
Follow the money, as they say. Sometimes understanding the motivations behind a message can be just as important as the message itself.
100%. And that kind of critical thinking, it's especially crucial when we're talking about these really complex situations,
Yeah.
geopolitics, global power dynamics. There's rarely one simple answer.
It's all very shades of gray, right?
Yeah.
So we've talked about colonialism, about how China is engaging with the global economy, those internal dynamics within the country, and of course, this need to be critical of what we're consuming in the media to think for ourselves. But where does that leave us, really? What's the bigger picture here?
Well, this is where I think Ferrana's book gets even more interesting because he starts to look ahead. He starts asking, what if China's rise actually signals a shift away from Western dominance,
Towards a more multipolar world, like some experts have been talking about.
Right. A world where power isn't concentrated in just one place, but it's spread out more evenly between several major players.
It sounds like almost utopian in a way.
Hmm.
But I imagine it's not all smooth sailing, right? There would be challenges too if that were to happen.
Definitely. And Ferrana doesn't pretend like there wouldn't be. He asks some tough questions like, what would a multipolar world actually look like, in practice? Would it mean more cooperation between countries? Or would it actually lead to more conflict? Would it be a more stable world? Or would it just create a whole new set of tensions?
And these are just theoretical questions either, right? Like these are things we need to be thinking about now because even if a multipolar world isn't a guarantee, it's definitely a possibility.
Yeah, and to Ferrana's credit, he doesn't pretend to have all the answers. He lays out different scenarios, looks at what other people are saying, and he even says, there are very powerful forces that want to maintain that Western dominance to prevent that shift from happening. He even questions whether a truly multipolar world is even possible, realistically.
Oh, it's not a done deal either way. There's still a lot that could happen.
Exactly. And that's what I think makes this whole discussion so fascinating, so relevant. We're literally living through this period of massive change, and China's place in all of it, it's still being written,
It's like we're all standing at a fork in the road, and the choices that we make today, both individually and as a global community, they're going to determine which path we end up on.
And that goes back to, I think, Ferrana's core message. We have to be informed, we have to be engaged, and we have to be willing to really think critically about these issues. Because the future isn't something that just happens to us, right? It's something we actually create through our choices and our actions.
He wants us to move past those simplistic narratives, the China as a threat or China as a savior kind of thing, and really grapple with the complexity of it all.
Because if we want to be able to navigate the challenges and the opportunities, frankly, of this century, we have to understand China, their history, their motivations, those internal struggles we were talking about. All of it matters.
And as we're trying to understand China's role in all of this, Ferrana reminds us there's another piece of the puzzle we need to consider, maybe the most important one. He keeps saying, don't forget the human element in all of this. It's easy to get caught up in the geopolitical stuff, but
at the end of the day, it's about people, right? The decisions that governments make, corporations make, they have real impacts on people's actual lives.
And not just in some vague, theoretical way. We're talking jobs, communities being transformed, the environment. These big forces have very real consequences.
And I think Ferrana wants us to remember that, especially when we're trying to wrap our heads around China's place in the world. It's easy to get lost in the abstract, but there's always a human cost or a human potential that we have to consider.
He even says one of the biggest mistakes the West makes is not really trying to understand the Chinese people's perspectives, their hopes, their struggles, all of that. It's like we've got this caricature of China as this one big thing, and we forget there are actual individuals living there.
It's dehumanizing, in a way, and it keeps us from really getting a handle on how complicated the situation actually is. If we want to deal with China effectively, we have to move past these simple stories we tell ourselves and recognize that there are all sorts of experiences within the country.
See each other as, well, people trying to figure things out in a messy world, not just pawns in some strategy game.
Exactly. And that takes empathy, being willing to listen, to try and understand perspectives, even if they're different from our own.
It's not about saying wrongdoing doesn't matter or ignoring the tough stuff. It's about recognizing that there's more to it than that.
And maybe, just maybe, if we can do that, we can find some common ground, build bridges instead of just walls, you know. But there's one more layer to this, I think. Something else to consider about China's impact on the world.
On top of everything else we've talked about.
Even beyond what Ferrana is arguing in the book, think about it. As China becomes more influential, their model for development with the state-led stuff, the emphasis on infrastructure, other developing countries, they're watching. And some of them are starting to copy it.
So it's not just goods and services that China's exporting. It's a whole different way of thinking about how countries grow and develop, the role of government, all of it.
Right. So the question becomes, could China's success, going from poverty to a global power so quickly, could that actually inspire other countries to go a different way? A path that maybe challenges the Western model we've had for decades.
It's kind of a mind-blowing idea, isn't it? Like, are we seeing the beginning of a totally new model for development? One that has different values, different priorities?
It's too early to say for sure, but it's something to keep an eye on for sure. Because if other countries really do embrace this model, it could completely change how the world works.
It's like we've been so worried about China being a threat that we haven't considered that it might, that it might change things for the better, or at least in a very different direction.
And I think that's a perfect place to wrap up what we've been talking about with Ferrana's book. We can't be afraid to ask these tough questions, challenge what we think we know, be open to possibilities even if they make us uncomfortable.
Because nothing is set in stone, right? We're all part of creating the future through the choices we make, the actions we take, how we engage with the world. And as we've seen today, understanding China is a huge part of that if we want to do it well.
Absolutely. So as you keep learning about China, reading the news, figuring out what you think about it all, remember what we talked about today. Be critical of what you're hearing. Be curious. And maybe most importantly, remember that the world is far more complex and nuanced than any one story can ever capture.